My name's ShawNshawN, and I do art on ShawNshawN.co and specials on eBay. Today we're going to review Tolkien. So Tolkien is the movie of the story of JRR Tolkien, the writer of The Hobbit and later Lord of the Rings. It starts from kind of his very youth when he's a little boy, maybe 8 or 10, and then it goes to his teenage years, and then it goes to his college years and a little bit beyond that. So basically his youth to about 30. So it covers kind of his formative years of how all the inputs that went into The Hobbit and then later the Lord of the Rings. And it's kind of interesting, covers a little bit about his story. He grew up in Africa with his mother, and then they're forced to go back to Birmingham, England. This is kind of the story they kind of skim through quickly. I mean, they can't cover too much material. I think it would have been nice to actually show scenes of where they lived in Africa, and a little bit of those sets would have put a really nice framework about JRR Tolkien and how his mother was kind of a polyglot and she homeschooled him, so he knew many languages going into university. So he was very well read and had actually started creating his own languages, which he created several different languages, which they talk about. Then he goes to university and he's sent his boarding house for orphans. He meets this girl who later becomes his first girlfriend. And, he introduces her a little bit to the club, which is this club of creatives. So the one's a painter, one's a poet, one's a musician, and he is kind of a writer and sketch kind of painter a little bit too. So they're all kind of creatives, and they're going to have this mission to, bond for life. And they meet together always at this tea house. That's kind of a really special bonding, and you can see how that influenced Tolkien's creativeness to, meet in a group, kind of a mentor group, and then later expand into writing these books. So obviously that's very formative. They cover that pretty well, I think. And also they cover the period of, a lot of how teenagers have to kind of rebel against their parents. And by that time, the parents had very controlling destinies, like they wanted to be lawyers and accountants and very respectable professions, and they didn't think anything of being a poet, a writer, a painter. And they really kind of poo-pooed their passions, which is really sad, but it's just the reality of that day. And it still exists, I think, in our today's world, where most people kind of follow what their parents think is best for them versus what's actually their passion. And another thing is, obviously World War I happens, all the boys decide to join up and go to the war and do the good deed to fight the greatest of all wars. And they go in this terrible trench warfare. What they've done in the film is they have kind of flashbacks and forward from this time frame over the rest of the film. And I think what they're trying to do is to show the real darkness of what you see in The Lord of the Rings. You have the real version of this horrible war in The Lord of the Rings. And, he went to war, so he actually has that real horrible experience. It comes across too when he made the film Lord of the Rings, which is done by Peter Jackson without any help from J.R.R. Tolkien, because he had passed in 73, and maybe Jackson had read the book when he was still alive, but that's about it. So you have this huge disconnect, but still you have that passion in the film, I think, from the book. So it's a really good interpretation, I would say. And then later, his girlfriend, he's forced to choose between his girlfriend and going to college, and he goes to college because that's the only realistic option at this point, because he's poor. So he needs a scholarship, so he breaks up with her because the father, Francis, tells him to. He writes her when he's 21 finally and says, no, I want her. I really love her and I really want to meet her again. I don't care about these other college girls. And she's already engaged, and he's like, oh no, what have I done? And luckily he's able to write a letter, and then they meet again, and she falls for him again, and they decide to get married anyway. And this is right before he goes off to the front in World War I, so she's marrying this guy who might be dead and who knows how quickly, And he comes back from the war, 2 of his friends are gone, so that's pretty traumatic. So it has kind of this nice feel of the events that lead into, the dramatism of The Lord of the Rings, how it's much darker than The Hobbit. And you get a lot of the reference points, like the Nazgul in Lord of the Rings, Nazis in World War II. He wrote it in the 30s going into, so he has that feel for that the Nazis are going down a dark path early on, and uses that kind of feel into the book. But yeah, they got a lot of the things. They don't really cover the writing so much. I mean, it is a visual film, so you have to use visuals. So they shows his drawing, and he would draw and then write his book, write his stories, and he had a really great script. I don't know if he wrote his novels this way. I mean, it definitely looks great on film, but I'm just curious if this is actually how he wrote, or he kind of, would add this fine script in parts of the novel. I'm not sure. So that's kind of an interesting take. I'm not sure. They didn't use any of the Tolkien family members, so you don't know if that's true or not. It still reads fine as a film. Yeah, since they're covering kind of a huge time frame from his youth to the 30s, it's kind of, some elements are lost. I mean, you're taking 30 years of history and come back to you in an hour and a half. There's only so much you can cover. I think they cover pretty good amounts. You know, they made the decision not to cover from 30 till 73 when he dies. And a lot of that time frame, he writes some other stories, but they're not as famous as The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. A lot of it's unfinished work. So there's probably not much to cover there. And then he becomes famous in the 60s with counterculture. But, you know, he's famous for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings from this time frame in his 30s. So I think they made the right decision there to cut that off. It might have been interesting to show, perhaps for the ending, like putting the gravestones in for Edith and then later him, and how he wrote some of the gravestone in, I think it was Elvish for one of the stories. You know, that kind of been interesting, or maybe showing a young Peter Jackson picking up a library book and reading The Lord of the Rings might have been really cool. And then how that spun up his ideas to start the films. That might have been a really cool take. I mean, that's about Peter Jackson, but Peter Jackson made The Lord of the Rings visually sell them. You know, obviously the book sold itself on its own, but it's kind of one of the great celebrations of taking a literary masterpiece and making a visual masterpiece. That would have been a kind of an interesting connection, I think. I think they covered this story pretty well, but they cover a lot of time frames, so it kind of feels like they're missing pieces. They're skimming a lot of the surface. Definitely they don't really cover the African scene, which would have been nice. I don't know if they covered the love story as well as they could have covered it. They cover, I think, the essentials. You know, that he's heartbroken and he doesn't know what to do, and then he's almost dropping out of school, and then he's playing rugby, and so they have kind of this innuendo in the thing. They don't have much of... I think if they would have had kind of reading the letters back and forth in the war would have been interesting as well, since, you know, people wrote letters back then. There's no email, there's no text, you know, there's no Twitter, so you would write letters, telegrams, this kind of thing. Those kind of, you know, actually showing people handwriting letters would have been kind of tied the story a little bit more together, because he's a writer, right? So showing him writing would have made more sense. They did show him writing his books, per se. I don't know if they captured the elements of showing him as a storyteller as well. They show, you know, the biography of his life, but not necessarily where he got his ideas for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And, you know, they kind of show a lot of the ingredients going in there, but I don't know if the ingredients lead to the cake, you know, per se. It's kind of getting there. You feel like you got to dough, but you didn't necessarily get the cake, the icing, the frosting. It does feel finished as a film, but I don't know, I just feel like they could have got a bit more of the literary sense a little bit more. You know, my nephew definitely said that, and he's a big time reader. I'm a big time reader. And so it would have been nice to show him on the typewriter, you know, typing things or writing hand letters, or, you know, kind of getting that, because that's the physical effort that goes into writing novels. You want to show a little bit of the physicality of it. So yeah, I might have changed it a little bit. I think they chose the right time frame though. Overall, it's a pretty good film, pretty interesting. I'll give it a thumbs up. Hopefully you guys like it as well. If you want to subscribe, you can subscribe below. And I'll see you in the next painting video. Or, yeah, painting video would be good too, but see you in the next movie review. Thanks for watching, guys.